It's great to be able to moderate this panel, and it's a very esteemed panel. As you can see on the screen, I'll introduce them shortly. But let me first say this. So Monday is International Women's Day. March is Women's History Month. So it's very timely for us to be having this discussion today. And the theme, as some of you may have seen for International Women's Day, is hashtag choose to challenge. And I think that's a good tone for us to kind of embrace when we think about this topic. Be willing to challenge the status quo, be willing to challenge outdated norms. And I think, quite frankly, be willing to challenge ourselves as an industry to do better in addressing these very significant disparities between men and women, particularly when we look at the rural agriculture scene. So let me first frame the topic, and then I will introduce each of the panelists. The story of women in Asian agriculture is one of stark disparity. Nothing captures and conveys this more than the narrative of rural women propelling agricultural production. Women make up over 40% of the agricultural labour force. They produce more than half of the food grown globally and provide between 50 and 90% of the labour needed for Asian rice cultivation. Yet they also receive just 7% of agricultural investment, are overrepresented in unpaid or low-paid seasonal jobs, and they suffer unequal access to land and productive resources. And then when we think in the context of COVID-19, it's only exacerbated these realities and in fact yielded new ones as well. The pandemic has caused disruption to maternal health care in rural developing countries. It's only increased already unacceptable unpaid workloads for females, and has contributed to a spike in gender-based violence against women. Meanwhile, women in other parts of the larger agricultural workforce face disparities of their own, whether they're financial or stereotypes, barriers to leadership and management and so forth, and a variety of resource inequalities among them. So today's discussion is to really dive into this topic. It is complex, it has many different dimensions, and we won't hope to cover it in the time that we have, but it's an opportunity for us to look at these issues, think about what our role as an industry is as we tackle them together. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists. First of all, Elizabeth Hernandez, and I think probably a lot of people on the call know Elizabeth already. Elizabeth is Head of External Affairs and Sustainability at Corteva for the Asia Pacific region. So she leads the external engagement strategy for the region for Corteva. Elizabeth has over 25 years of experience in Asia, mostly with multinationals, including GSK, Hewlett-Packard, Facebook, and of course DuPont. A recognised thought leader, Elizabeth speaks frequently on sustainability, women empowerment, and creating shared value. Elizabeth served 2 terms on the board of governors for AmCham in Singapore, and she currently serves on the boards of WOMAG, that's Women in Agribusiness Asia. Many of you will be familiar with that organisation, and Digital Impact Alliance. She's also the founding member of Keynote Women Speakers, a global platform that advocates for gender diversity on the world stage. So welcome, Elizabeth. Our second panelist is JOJI PANTOJA. So JOJI is based in the Philippines, and she is the CEO and founder of Coffee for Peace, which is a social enterprise that was founded in 2008 and promotes the culture of peace through coffee. In this capacity, JOJI is protecting the environment, she's empowering farmers and promoting peace and reconciliation in our land. JOJI has also been engaged in the Peace Builders community in Davao, the Philippines, as Chief of Operations, forming peace and reconciliation communities throughout the land and equipping them with skills on issues that are faced by 21st century globalization. And we're going to hear more about what JOJI's been involved in, because it really is quite extraordinary what she's been doing in the Philippines. And then last but not least, John Young-Simpson's our third panelist, managing partner of Bluegrass Partners. John has more than 12 years of experience in investing in the agribusiness and food sectors across both Asia and also Southeast Africa. He also has a broader background of over more than 20 years operating and investing in emerging and frontier markets. He's worked extensively in multi-stakeholder forums on behalf of the financial investment sector, and he also sits on a number of different boards, both private and public, and like Elizabeth, is a board member of WOMAG here in Singapore. So I think you'll all agree, very different backgrounds with our panelists, very different perspectives. I'm looking forward to jumping into this topic. And I'm going to start by asking a question, throwing a question to John, which is a very broad question, but I think will get us started. So the disparity between women and men growers, in particular, when we talk about access to land, access to finance, healthcare, and a host of other resources, it's a chronic problem. It's not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. But I'm interested in, from your experience, John, and what you see in the work that you've done. What do you think, if there was one thing holding us back more than anything, what do you think it is that's really preventing us making progress in this area in rural communities?
Thank you, BETHWYN, for the introduction, and honored to be with you and the other panelists today and with the CropLife Asia board. Very difficult question indeed, and there's obviously no silver bullet. The dichotomy and the problem here is massive, as you've outlined. On one side, women make up to 60% of the rural employment force in many countries. They're over 600 million livestock farmers are female globally. As you laid out, more than half the world's food is produced by women, and thus forth, kind of empowerment, women's empowerment, have a direct impact on productivity and household food security. But at the same time, the gender gap is just across all of the assets of land, livestock, labor, education, access to extension, access to financial services. Myself, coming from the finance background, I worked for many years investing on behalf of European pension funds, US banks, etc., in the agribusiness space in emerging markets in these countries that we're talking about in Southeast Asia, Southern Eastern Africa, where a lot of the end recipients to the money that we're deploying and the financing that we're providing to smallholder farmers and to women in agribusiness is being controlled by investment committees that only have men on them, boards of directors that only have men on them, investment teams that I was part of that only had men on them. So just even from that sector where it's men handing money to companies whose recipients at the end of the day are women is just grossly unfair and inequitous. Women in all regions have less access to land than men. Between 3 and 20% of all landholders globally are women, so completely underrepresented. As you said, women receive only 7% of agricultural investment directly, but they're 10 times more likely to invest their earnings in their family's own well-being of health, education, and nutrition. So we have all these SDGs where we're aiming for child health, education, and nutrition. SDG 5 about women surely is just one of the most important lenses through which to frame, in my industry, our investment, frame agricultural productivity increases on behalf of the crop science and chemical and industry as well. But just as you say, those barriers are massive. Another kind of thing to highlight now, as there's massive consolidation happening in agriculture. Agriculture is changing very quickly because of technology, very sophisticated technologies now moving into our supply chain. And if we just think about the kind of legal and social barriers that limit women and their ability to adapt and benefit to these changes. So, I mean, it's very difficult to see in our lifetime how the gender how gender parity could basically exist. But short term, there's so much that can be done. We're all here today, people of positions, whether we're owning our own companies, sitting on the boards of other companies, just starting at home, doing what we do, calling ourselves out and getting rid of kind of very poor habits that even exist amongst very well-educated people but then working in multilateral, multi-stakeholder processes to try and share as much information, bringing as much information into the private sector to really help private sector actors who are able to make an impact. To come back to my own supply chain again, or my own focus in finance, we actually do have tools in order to affect outcomes and affect behaviors in industry. Sustainability-linked loans are gaining traction, which can really provide a carrot and stick to how companies behave. At the moment, they're really using environmental KPIs to govern these loans and how they work. But why are we not using gender as a core focus in how we try and get companies to behave? So eliminating discrimination against women starts at home. It starts in our own companies, but through agricultural resources, education, extension, financial services, labor markets, etc. There's so many policies that can be implemented that we already know about, and starting there. And when it comes to technology, investing in this labor-saving, production-enhancing technologies, again, putting gender in the middle of that will really help to change things, as a lot of these supply chains that we see that are so antiquated in many ways in how they behave. Technology may well change that. Women need to be at the center of that. And so again, short and medium term, there really is a lot that we can be doing, and we should not give up that ambition of gender parity. I hope that kind of answers some of your questions, BETHWYN.
You make it sound like a very big problem, and it is, right? It is. It's complex, has many different dimensions. So, but it's interesting your perspective, and I think when you say putting gender in the middle of things, when it comes to initiatives, I think that's a switch, perhaps to how we've thought in the past. Elizabeth, with all of your experience in the external affairs world, public affairs, and so forth. When we think about gender diversity, we're seeing a lot more stakeholders, I think, all along the value chain, all aspects of the value chain now being more vocal on issues impacting rural women in particular. And so this sort of spills over to the public awareness area as well in general. There are a growing number of platforms in terms of opportunities to really raise the voice of rural women, of positive case studies of women who have been very successful, either setting up new businesses and so forth, but also platforms that highlight the disparities between rural women and men as well. I'm interested in your perspective on this. In your field, you get very involved in different platforms. Do you have any insights as to perhaps one or two platforms that are unique and perhaps having an impact in this space?
Thank you for the question, BETHWYN, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I wanted to go back though on a little bit to pivot from where John was from an investment side. That at Corteva, when we started the company, we wanted to make sure that we were engaging and supporting women in ag, from more developed countries like the US to the subsistence farmers here in Asia. So one of the first things we did was actually a global survey of women in agriculture. Over 4,000 women participated in October 2018. 25% of them were here in Asia, India, China, Indonesia, Australia, and to ask them really whether, one, they were seeing still this gender disparity and discrimination, and where they think the key pain points and where we could affect some of the biggest impact. And 80% of the women around the world focus on the access to training and education resources. That was the number one. This number two was some of the other support services like financing, John mentioned, or even legal in some cases, kind of support to really look at the business. It's not just agricultural training and education, it's the business side of it, right? I think sometimes we forget that farmers are also business people and they need all the other functions and expertise that we use in our corporations. And finally, the third one was raising awareness of the successful women in agriculture, showing them as examples, to other women, that there is a group of them, and sometimes or often they're invisible. They're kind of in a supporting role, and the more visible one is the husband or the brother. And so raising that or putting a spotlight on women in agriculture. So one of the things that we did, knowing we didn't want to recreate the wheel, there are many different efforts to support women in ag, but they're rather fragmented. And so what we did is we partnered with Grow Asia, with Agrea in the Philippines, with WOMAG, and we're looking for more partners from this group to create a digital platform. It's called growher.org. So you can look it up right now while I'm speaking. But the idea is to try to bring like-minded organizations that are all working to empower women in ag in a single digital platform, so we can find each other more easily and collaborate and scale up the efforts we're doing on the ground. So the 3 pillars of Grow Her are to inspire women by featuring all of these amazing women in agriculture that have been successful, whether it's someone who goes from OPV to hybrid corn in Indonesia or the Philippines, or someone in China who's used drone technology to be able to address labor shortage in potato farms in her province. There's a very diverse group of women all using different parts of the agricultural technologies to be successful and to highlight and really kind of celebrate those women. The second pillar is that education training that I said was a key pain point for them. How do they find those resources available, whether it's information or training that they can join in that second pillar, so to inform them. And then the third piece is to include her, is to really create that community of women in agriculture. And we all in our companies already reach out to farmers and do a lot of that training, farmer meetings, demo plots every day. But the question is, are we providing a safe space for women to learn among other women? Because what we found is it's not enough to offer it to men and women in country. It's important that you create that safe space so they can learn at their pace and really among their peers to learn from each other. That's the more effective learning. So if you think of those 3 pillars and you connect that digital platform of Grow Her to local partners that are doing this kind of training and hand-holding of the women in country, it's that kind of partnership. So it's both digital and offline that we're able, we think, to scale up. And so it's early days. We launched Grow Her in October 2020 for International Day of Rural Women, but we're scaling that up and reaching out also to our food system colleagues to be able to multiply the number of like-minded organizations that are doing this great work and reach out to women. We've got a big number of women to reach out to here in Asia Pacific.
That's terrific, Elizabeth. I mean, it's a tremendous initiative, and I think a lot of your ideas as well. When I think about our next panelist, JOJI, a lot of it's sort of brought to life in what she has done on the ground. So JOJI, I would love for you to just share your story in many ways. It's very inspiring in terms of the initiatives that you've developed in the Philippines, Copy for Peace, and how you've used that as a way to really empower women in those communities.
Well, in the Philippines, most of the farming communities that we have visited are 50% women farmers. And of course, the challenges that we faced during those times are the farm to market road, because their accessibility to go to their farm is hard. And most of the time it's lack of knowledge from them that this help are available to them. And also identification, like they cannot access finances because they don't have proper ID. So those are the things that we have encountered working with farmers, especially tribal communities. So what we did, because most of them are not formally educated, some of them just reach grade 4 elementary school education. They can read some, but not that much. So we have modified our training material so that it can go across them with our communication. So we use the material that is more of a comic form, more pictures, so that we can educate them. And we strengthen their self-respect or self-identification, why they do what they do, why do they do that, and do they love what they do. So basically, we focus on that theme with Coffee for Peace because we worked in conflicted areas here in Mindanao. So most of the places that we got involved with are either has armed conflict and that we have to really walk with the military and walk with the rebel group and see and reach out to those farmers that are really just farming, not involved in two factions, and trying to provide livelihood through coffee. That's why we called it conflict sensitive coffee. So we train them on what the market needs, what type of coffee, what kind of processes that this market needs so that we can link them to the market. And we taught them how to become an entrepreneur themselves by guiding them and working with them, learning by doing. So we started in 2008, and by 2011, we were able to export their coffee in Canada. And the good surprise was most of these communities right now, we have trained 13 indigenous people communities and around 800 coffee farmers all across the Philippines. And some of them are marketing their own coffee right now, but still we encounter, financing for these women because lack of identification, they cannot access funds until we created some kind of a vouching system. So we vouch for them. We created a cluster community, an association or cooperative that could vouch that their coffee produce has a market so that they can be accepted by the bank to borrow a little bit of money so that they can increase their production. So we do a lot of listening and lots of innovation on how we can help these marginalized women farmers, because most of them, 60%, are women entrepreneurs in the coffee industry. So those are the things that we have done. And in the Philippines, we are happy to say that we have produced successful farmers. And right now we are trying to scale them up and really multiply those models that we have created. Thank you.
So it's a very tremendous story. I mean, it's great to hear as well that you're taking some steps to scale up. And if we were able to scale up that model more broadly, obviously beyond the Philippines, then that's the kind of impact that we're looking for here. So it's a great example. I think I might like to take a question from the panel, just as we're speaking about these disparities at the rural farming level. And there is a question, Elizabeth, directed to you. Have you done any survey in countries like India and Pakistan to understand more about women in agriculture there?
Yes. I can tell you that in that survey that I mentioned that we did globally, the highest number of women who acknowledged that there's still a very strong gender inequality and gender discrimination was actually in India. So that is, and that's one country where we purposely have separate group training programs for women, and we also use trainers or the lead farmers, what we call our Pravakta program, for example, which is kind of I believe that Pravakta means spokesperson, but we use it as kind of our women ambassador program. So they train other women farmers. And we found that in India in particular, we really need to separate the training programs for the men and then the one for the women, because when we tried to do them together, invariably what would happen is the men might let the women, their spouses, be there for the classroom part of the training. But then at the moment we start moving to the field for the field demonstrations, they're kind of shooing away the women and telling them to like go home and not participate in the field activities. And you and I know that that's the most critical part of the training, is when they can actually see it in the field. And so we've decided since then we create as I said, that safe space for women, have a separate training program. And the other thing that you need to be mindful of is the timing of it, timing it so that it allows the women to balance her housework and child work with being able to have access to the training on the farm. And there are other things that perhaps concerns her, like healthcare of the family or her own personal healthcare, particularly during time of COVID, that we sometimes complement our training programs on agriculture, not just on the use of our products or our ag inputs, but also agronomy and finance, as I said, the business skills that kind of are necessary for these women. And increasingly, we're finding actually that as many of the men are moving into urban centers to look for higher paying jobs, we are seeing more women as head of household, and yet they've been left there to head of household, but without the training and preparation for it. So that's why it's a really big gap that we need to anticipate. And then one other area that we're doing in both Pakistan and in India is creating what we call our agripreneur program. And we've got in Pakistan a silage program, so women are being trained in specific kind of value addition to agriculture, right? So it's a silage entrepreneurs. And in working with an NGO called Pradhan in India, we're actually focusing on the mechanization component. Like one of the things that's leaving people behind and haven't been able to really scale their success is the lack of mechanization. So we're actually creating a group of women entrepreneurs that are filling that gap using a shared economy model to offer, the sowers, for example, to use in direct seeded rice. So at the same time as we're transitioning farmers to direct seeded rice for sustainable reasons, we're also filling a gap in the mechanization of that market. So again, looking at it more from holistically as a value chain and seeing where there are gaps that women can actually fill. Thanks.
That's a lot of great initiatives. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm going to take another question from the panel, and I don't know if Julia is still there from CropLife International. Shanghi, is Julia there? Because there's a question regarding what CropLife International is doing, if anything, to specifically focus on empowering women farmers across the globe.
She have locked out already. Sorry about that.
She's not there. Okay.
Yep.
We'll take that one on notice. I think that I'm sure in different associations of CropLife International or CropLife around the world, there's different activities or different initiatives in training, and I think it's a good idea for us to sort of leverage and learn on what's happening in other parts of the world. But we'll certainly take that one on notice. And there's another question relating to, I think, at the farming level in particular. Do we, and question directed to all of the panel, do we see women being more open to ag tech or ag advances, other innovations in agriculture? Do we think women are more open to those new innovations? Any thoughts on that?
Bethwyn, I just to partially answer that question. What's been very interesting about ag tech is that it's brought a whole different cohort and kind of person into the agricultural industry, which is certainly more diverse. Just if we look at where we're based here in Singapore, I think most people on the call are. In Singapore, 13 years ago in the ag industry, it was really traders that were here, all men, financiers who were here, all men. And in many ways, that's the origination of WOMAG. It's where it came from, is from women working in those industries, trying to create their own safe space. And now in Singapore, fast forward a decade, with a huge amount of ag tech that exists here, it's a much more creative, diverse, and kind of interesting sector to work in with agriculture, and women are wholly much better represented. I can't answer that on the ground. I haven't seen any actual research there. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
I'd like to add, Bethwyn, that one of the things that I will say that perhaps because women farmers are coming from a less confident position in terms of the training on agricultural inputs, right? So I'm thinking of just what we bring as CropLife members. We found that when they take a training from us, they actually follow much more carefully and therefore get better results at the end. So if you're thinking of how you're going to increase yield by using both seeds, crop protection, the timing of that, you'll see a much better result. And it's interesting because I think they actually feel that they're so hungry for that knowledge or training that when they do get it, they will follow. And the example that I can tell you, as I was touring the Philippines, different rice farmers in Leyte, I remember visiting different farmers, and the male farmers would just talk. You try to ask them when was the last time they sprayed or what did they do, and they were trying to remember the date and couldn't quite give you the details. When I got to one of the women farmers, she actually pulled out a sheet from her back pocket, and it was kind of the calendar of the cropping season, right, that we provide with our products. And she had the date written down exactly when was the last time that she had sprayed. So she knew when the next one would be due. And it's that kind of level of a detail and attention that I love, right, that I see from, and I'm generalizing perhaps by saying, by sharing this anecdote, but I think it's that precision. And we also see that translated in our seed growers. So we have seed production in between 70,000 to 100,000 seed growers here in APAC. And it's a much more technical skill, as you know, to grow the seeds. And most of them are women, because they're the ones that have the patience to follow and be trained on those technologies and the processes. And so we're constantly recruiting much more women for those roles. So I would say that, yes, it's possible that, you know, if you actually unlock that training to them, that you'll see an increase in yield and phenomenal contribution to food security in the region and globally.
That's very interesting feedback. So yes, and to me, it just again sums up why diversity is so important, you know, in terms of the strength that the different genders bring. I will continue to invite people to bring their questions forward through the chat box. So anybody who's on the call, please feel free to bring forward questions. I'm wanting to shift the conversation a little bit from rural farmers themselves, the women farming, men farming, to actual a little bit closer to home from the member companies in terms of our own employees. If we think about our field teams, if the plant science industry, whether the teams are selling seeds, biotech, crop protection products, even fertilizer for that matter, I think when we look at the market, we see a lot of male-dominated field teams. And it seems to me that unless we, you know, a bit to your point, Elizabeth, unless we look to really create more diversity even in our own teams, then we are going to be limiting our potential as an industry in terms of being able to advance sustainable agriculture. Again, I'm going to throw the question to you firstly, Elizabeth. You have an interesting background because you've come to agriculture from elsewhere, which is always, I think, great because you have a fresh perspective on things. You've obviously spent a lot of time in the field pre-COVID, I assume. I'm interested in your thoughts when you think about our companies and the plant science industry in the field. What do you think the barriers are at that level in terms of our sales, our marketing, our technical services teams? What do you think the barriers are to getting more women into those roles, and what might we be able to do differently as an industry?
Thanks, BETHWYN. And one of the things, a caveat, I guess, that I would say is it's not the same for every country, right? We have such a diverse region, so it varies from country to country. But for us at Corteva, we probably look at the field force and then kind of the office-based workers kind of slightly differently. And in fact, in particular, because the field force typically in our companies are the ones that are the funnel really that create the commercial leadership teams eventually, right? So if you don't have women, you don't have a strong diversity in the field force, those that really get that kind of training earlier in the career, it's kind of hard to see a lot of women in those key commercial leadership positions. So some of them are really more beyond the control of the company, but it's like cultural norms and endemic in the societies, right? So one of the key things that we found when we surveyed our field force, in particular, the safety of women, right? Safety in traveling in remote areas, in rural areas, and the comfort level that their families would have in allowing them to do that. So some of the basic things we introduced when that was raised was going in tandem. Like it's not women traveling on their own, but always in pairs and with a colleague, not necessarily a woman, but it could be a male colleague, partnering up when they're doing those kinds of field trips. So field visits. So the safety is probably the key thing that we can address. I know that we've been told that the lack of public toilets in some of these rural areas is also something that is a barrier for some of the women to take on these roles, and particularly in places like rural India, right, or even rural Indonesia. And so there are systemic issues like that that perhaps we can address as an industry, and putting a little bit more pressure in to governments to be able to put those kinds of facilities. Because if we really want to have diversity in our leadership, particularly commercial leadership in our companies, we do need to address the field force and ensure that we're able to do that. Now, in some countries like China, that may not be as much of an issue, or at least hasn't been raised as much to us. And really the issues we see there are more on different kind of roles, like we mentioned AgTech earlier. Really getting them excited, young people especially, to go into agriculture is another challenge for us, men and women, as you have aging populations. Is to the use of technology, I think, digital technologies in particular, are one way to really attract and retain talent to stay in the rural communities, but with a very different role than perhaps they saw their parents take on before. So those are kind of two areas that we're looking at: the role of technology in countries like China, and the role of and safety and security of our field force for countries like India and Southeast Asia.
Right, thank you. And I know we're almost out of time, and I don't see any more questions come through, but for John and JOJI, I might throw one last question to each of you in terms of, as we think about our plant science industry, do you have any thoughts or advice for us as an industry in terms of what we might be able to do, adding to the sorts of ideas that Elizabeth has already shared, to help improve gender diversity and address this as I say, chronic issue in terms of disparities at the rural agricultural level with gender?
I think what we could is also collaborate with our government in terms of developing our farm to market road, because aside from the hygiene for the field worker in the field area, in rural areas, it's the access to those areas, because the roads are only available for horses or small motorcycles, and sometimes it's so hard. So collaboration with the government. Another thing is probably making the technology easy to learn for women and smaller in capacity, especially in rural areas wherein when you harvest coffee and it gets fermented because you don't have the pulper, then it will be sacrificing the taste. So, but to have a big depulper up in the mountains would be so hard for the carabao or the motorcycle to carry. So we have to think of smaller unit that would be applicable for cluster farmers that they can use as a community, that are adaptable without electricity, or provide probably solar panel to provide electricity. So those little things that would help decrease the disparity between urban farmers and rural farmers. So that's what I think.
Thanks, JOJI. Great insights. Any final comments, John?
No, there's such great insights from the ground, and it makes me really miss being out in the field with on the farms, etc. I guess from a perspective, it's really about reaching out with organizations like WOMAG. I'll let maybe Elizabeth finish with a bit more on WOMAG, but reaching out with other partner organizations. Often many actors in the private sector are very scared about multilateral engagement, very worried about holding governments to account, as JOJI was saying there, always nervous about exposing themselves. But in order to overcome these hurdles, we really need to work together. and kind of focus organizations through your lobbying organizations like CropLife and activist organizations, etc., through organizations like WOMAG. By working together, we can make some progress.
Thanks, John. Gustavo, did you have something to say or no? I can read your mind.
Yeah, no, I did have, but I think it was your question, Bethwyn. If you allow me to say 1 minute, I'm really delighted that we are having this discussion here. Despite the progress I think we have made, there is still a lot of bias and a lot of challenges. Definitely more difficult in certain countries than others, and I think we mentioned Pakistan, but I would say also Bangladesh. And also looking to our own organizations, I would also add perhaps Japan and Korea. Yeah, but my question was, what would be one thing we would need to focus going forward as member companies? And what I take away, but Elizabeth, John, and Felicitas, you can correct me, but trying to invest in development and learning activities towards not looking to the typical male farmer and we go with the male troops, but really thinking on the female farmers and what the kind of knowledge they need to get from us. Did I get it right? It's what would be your, let's say, one recommendation or main recommendation?
Yes, Gustavo, if it's for the women farmers in the field, I would say yes. The training content might be similar, but creating a forum, a safe space for them to maximize that learning among other women would be key thing that I would recommend, particularly in places like India and even in Southeast Asia. If you're talking about our own field force and our own women in our companies, then that's when I was talking more around the safety and security of them being in those roles, because that's how you get the experience, right? And the knowledge of our industry. You can't get that working in the office. It's really being out in the field. And if they don't feel comfortable or safe, and their families don't feel comfortable and safe to allow them to take on those roles, and it's going to be a persistent challenge for us to be able to recruit women in those roles. So I think doing more around that, to be able to, particularly the field force, have the diversity there, because I think you probably will agree with me that those are the ones that become future leaders in our industry. You have to have that experience on the ground and not just in the offices and the city centers.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Gustavo, for the question. So I think I will close the discussion here. But look, this is it's a complex topic. It's a broad topic. There's no way that we could cover it in any depth today. But I think some really terrific insights from the panel. So I appreciate that. And I do think, from where I sit, that there is a groundswell of change happening. I do feel that. And to be honest, from a leadership perspective, it can be forced on not only us as companies, but other industries as well. Investors are very clearly demanding our leaders to explain what are we doing to create a more equitable society, and what are companies doing to create more diversity in their ranks and throughout their organization. So that pressure from that investment community, that won't translate overnight to changes at the coalface, in the rural communities, but it's heading in the right direction, I think, across the board. And I think it's incumbent on us as an industry and as leaders and a group of people and organizations who are at the forefront of sustainable innovation and sustainable agriculture, that it's incumbent on us to help drive that change. So I really appreciate Elizabeth, JOJI, John, for joining us today, for your really valuable insights. I hope that everybody who had the opportunity to join this session takes away something to think about what we can be doing differently to support this change. So with that, Shanghi, back to you.